Ladies and gentlemen, you got Harrington here. Okay, it's Friday. I'm out of uniform. Sorry about that. Got the glasses on because I've been working all day, and I'm baked from the Miami Open. See, I find it's important to get those excuses out there early, don't you? Like once you've already messed up, it's a little too late. Oh yeah, by the way, I got to catch a flight in a couple of hours. So with all those disclaimers in place, hopefully you guys will cut me a little slack. Let's do this. I got a topic I think you're going to enjoy today. It's something I always enjoy talking about. It's asset protection. Now, before you make the face, Jeff, you've done that already. It's true. I have spent a little time talking about asset protection, but I did it in broad strokes. For example, I talked about, you'll remember our video about international or so-called offshore asset protection. And then I compared that with what you can do here onshore, the domestic asset protection. But I've just dealt with it at that level, just the highest level, just touching those concepts. Today, a rather timely topic. Lots of people are asking about it. Let's drill down a little bit further. Let's get into the domestic asset protection trust. I think you'll find this interesting, and here we go. Our Practice Makes Perfect is the podcast for business owners and real estate investors, siempre con un cariño especial para los clientes extranjeros. All right, part one. So asset protection. Let's just take a half step back. What is that? All right. Now, there are lots of different ways that you can do asset protection, right? I mean, if you just create a company and put your rental property in there, for example, or just run your business through an LLC or corporation, obviously that's a form of asset protection, right? You get the corporate shield. And so that's what you're doing. You're protecting your personal assets, separating it from your business activities. Also, recall from our last episode when we were talking about deeds, the concept of by the entireties. Here in Florida, spouses can own real property by the entireties. You can even own bank accounts or have bank accounts by the entireties. And what that means is the creditor of one spouse can't get to anything that's owned by the entireties for the reasons I explained in the last video. But that's a form of asset protection. Here's another quick example. Also for those of us who live in Florida, the concept of homestead, your primary residence, where you live. Homestead protection is famously good. Sometimes infamously good. But, that's another form of asset protection. No creditors really, other than the lender who helped you buy the property, can touch your homestead. So the reason for bringing that up is because when clients come to me for asset protection, it's usually a combination of techniques. It's not usually just one thing. However, the centerpiece of that strategy is usually going to be a trust. So that's what we're going to drill down on today. In particular, the asset protection trust. Here we go with part two. Again, half a step back. Let's talk about trust. I mean, there are so many different types of trust. It's ridiculous. I couldn't name them all. You get your special needs trust. You get your land trust. You get your, trusts that are set up just for tax purposes. There are many, many different types of trusts. What we're going to be focusing on here today are the asset protection trusts. Now, let me just interject something here because this actually came up recently in a video conference I was doing. Bear in mind, because we have all these different kinds of trusts, and they each have a different specific purpose, right? So, there are trusts that are designed to make you more tax efficient. There are trusts that will protect your assets, obviously. There are trusts that are designed for estate planning. And sometimes you can set up one trust that will accomplish multiple purposes, but not always. That's important to bear in mind. Sometimes they might even be contradictory. The trust that offers you the best asset protection may not, in fact, offer you the most efficient tax structure. It's kind of what I ran into with that particular video conference that I'm thinking about. And while we're on that topic, the topic of trade-offs, let me just add one more thought as it's coming to me. There is often trade-offs. We're going to get into asset protection trusts. We're going to be focusing on that. So, don't expect that these trusts are necessarily the best for tax purposes or the best for estate planning purposes. In fact, they probably are not. So there's going to be that kind of a trade-off. And then there's another important trade-off, which is convenience. Really, in my experience, and I don't know if there's another way around this, but for the most part, I'm sure it's true to say this, the greater the protection you get, the less convenient. More convenience, less protection. And we'll explain why that is. But, trade-offs. That's an important part of this asset protection analysis. You're going to maybe want to find the right balance that works best for your particular circumstances. But Although you can do many, many things, I love trusts. They're very advantageous, but I'm not going to sit here and tell you you can have it all. There's probably going to be some kind of trade-off. With that said, let's dive into part 3, the asset protection trust. Okay, start with this. What is the basic concept of a trust in the context of asset protection? The concept is this. Now, you are a human being, but for legal purposes, you are an estate, meaning all that you own is your estate. And that's the concept we use for legal purposes, for tax purposes, even when you die, you leave behind your estate. I don't want to confuse you, but I'm going to try this. So, you know how in the United States we have a progressive tax system. So the greater your assets or the greater your income, your household income, then the higher the bracket you're in, and so you're taxed at a higher rate. Well, some wealthy people will find it worthwhile to set up a trust that will take some of their income out of their estate. You separate that from your estate, and that may bring you down to a lower tax bracket and result in savings. We're going to do something very similar when it comes to asset protection. We're going to take some of your assets and we're going to put them into a separate trust, thereby removing them from your estate. And why would we want to do that? And we're not talking about taxation now. I've already given you the reasons for doing that. But why would we want to separate your assets for asset protection purposes? Well, the reason is twofold. And you need to understand this concept. Threats can come from 2 different directions, at least at a minimum. But let's 2 main directions. One, the threat could be to you personally. So you have a creditor, somebody suing you, whatever. There's some kind of threat against you personally. And in that instance, you're going to want to protect your assets from the creditor who's trying to get to you personally. Like if you have a company, for example. So you'll want to protect your company's assets from your personal threat. That's one angle. The opposite angle is also true. Your company can have threats. They can have creditors. It can be sued. You may have a rental property and you want to, and that could result in threats as well, right? Somebody gets hurt in the property, whatever, they're going to be suing. And so in that case, the threat is coming through the entity, or it's aimed at the entity, and you want to make sure that threat doesn't reach you personally and your personal assets. So those are 2 related but different concerns, and the way we set up the asset protection plan may differ depending upon whether you're trying to protect, your company from your personal threats or vice versa. So these strategies are very personal in nature. We're going to sit down, you're going to tell me what your concerns are, and I'm going to craft a solution that fits your particular circumstances. Just the same, for purposes of this video, let's talk about your personal threats, creditors, whatever, financial creditors, or you could get in an accident, right? And maybe there's not enough insurance to cover the damages. That's completely, almost out of your control. There are all kinds of circumstances, exes, whatever, all kinds of threats that could come up in the future. And you always want to plan ahead. So then that leads me to talk about one quick concept. When it comes to asset protection, time is not on your side. Sooner is better than later. Why is that? Well, because one of the things that will break down an asset protection plan is if the judge thinks that you set this thing up, your trust or whatever it is, whatever the plan is, if you set it up to avoid one particularly identifiable creditor. Let's say, for example, you've already been sued. So now you know where the threat's coming from, you know who the creditor is, and to avoid that creditor being able to collect, you set up a whole plan. All right, now, it's still better to do it later than never. You're still better off with that setup than without it. However, it's going to be more vulnerable. So when it comes to asset protection, the sooner you get things in place, the better. And one of the great things about doing this early is that, well, one, it can actually serve as your estate planning. And in any event, if you set up the scheme is the word we use, but I hate to use that word. It sounds bad. And there's nothing illegal or improper about asset protection. In fact, it's just being smart. But my point is this. If you set it up now while there's no identifiable threat coming at you, then it's just estate planning, right? And there's no chance that a judge is going to look at it, years down the road and say, oh, you put all that together to avoid some particular creditor collecting on you. Okay, circling back. With all that in mind, you're going to set up a trust We're going to make it an asset protection trust, which means that it's going to, whatever you put in there, whatever assets you have in there, the bank account that you establish with this trust, the vehicles that you title in the name of that trust, the rental properties that you title in the name of that trust, boats, etc., whatever assets you put into that trust are going to be protected from creditors who are coming at you personally. How are we going to do that? Well, the very first thing is just having a trust at all. That in and of itself is a great form of asset protection. Why? Because trusts are super confidential. They're utterly private. You don't have to record your trust with the county clerk. So it's not going to be in the public record in that regard. You don't have to necessarily register it with the State Department like you would with a company. Here in Florida, it's called SunBiz. It's super transparent. Anybody can go online and just see who owns a company, where they live. It's very transparent. You don't have to do that with a trust. It can be completely off the books. So that in and of itself, just having a trust is already a great step towards asset protection. Just don't be obvious, don't make it easy. And then we circle back to the concept we were talking about before. How do we separate the assets in the trust from your personal estate? Because anything in your personal estate is attackable, right, by your creditors. Well, we do that in a couple of ways. One, we make the trust irrevocable. And two, you're not going to be your own trustee. All right, so let's run these down one at a time. The trust is going to be irrevocable. So that means you can't theoretically amend or revoke the trust at any time. Once it's set up, theoretically, and that's a whole different discussion, but theoretically, you can't touch it. It just stays in place as is. Spoiler alert, they're not really irrevocable. We just call it that. Don't tell anybody. The other thing is this. You're not going to act as your own trustee if it's a true asset protection trust. Recall what I said. It's a trade-off between protection and convenience. And the fact that you're not going to be your own trustee, that's inconvenient. Now you got to involve somebody else. Maybe somebody like me or a professional trustee or a loved one or whatever. You're going to have to use somebody else now to sign off on the trust business. That's a bit inconvenient. So why? Why should it be that your asset protection trust needs to be irrevocable? And why is it you can't be your own trustee? Now you got to bother somebody else, or you got to pay a professional trustee to act on behalf of the trust. Why? Well, as you can imagine, this concept of shielding assets from your personal creditors has been tested many times for many years throughout the country. And through all that case precedent, there's sort of materialized an understanding that control is very important. Most judges will say that if you, the debtor, the person who's being sued, control the assets of a trust, then those are your assets. And they're going to construe those assets as being part of your estate, and they're going to open it up and expose it to your creditors. How are we going to avoid that result? We're going to avoid it through these legal fictions because, again, don't tell anybody, but, you are in control of those assets. And the legal fiction is this. Judge, I've created this entity. The entity is separate from me. It's as though it were another person or a company, right? It's not me. It's a different entity. And I've put somebody else, the trustee, in charge of that entity. That's the person with all the authority. They're the ones making all the decisions, signing off on the trust business. I'm also not a beneficiary. Obviously, you're not going to be your own beneficiary, if I didn't mention that. Those are my kids or a loved one or another company of mine or another trust of mine or a charity, but it's somebody other than you personally. And Judge, I'm going to write it up so that I can never change that this trustee or his or her successor will be the ones making the decisions. I will never have any authority over that trust ever because it's irrevocable. So if you do all that, you can see where it's now very difficult for a judge to say that you control those assets, even though you actually will. So I've gone a bit longer than I was planning to. I'm going to go ahead and cut it off here. Let's just say that an asset protection trust has a couple of key features, being irrevocability and somebody else acting as a trustee, somebody who's not you. And that is traditionally what we think of when we think of an asset protection trust. There are lots of nuances to this. Let me just tell you that. There are lots of ways of maybe getting around or softening the inconvenience. So for example, here, I'll give you one example. Remember that the trust agreement is just a piece of paper. You put that thing in your safe or wherever, or I hold it for you in my archives. And that's it. It doesn't exist anywhere else. Nobody knows about this thing. It's not recorded. It's not in the public record at all. So what if, say, you don't have any current threats and you just want to get this all in place in case there is ever going to be some threat? What's to prevent you from acting as your own trustee until there's something glimmering on the horizon, and then you quickly resign and put somebody else in your place? See what I mean? There are lots of little tricks that we can play. But understand the basic concepts first. Irrevocable, somebody else your trustee. All right, so that's it. But I can see right now that we're going to have to spend a little more time on this topic. Let me come back next week and I'm going to talk to you about a self-settled asset protection trust. I'm also going to talk to you about two-layered approaches where like you have a trust LLC combo. And we'll dig a little more into the minutiae and some of the tricks that you can use that are going to be very, very handy for you. All right, guys, I'll talk to you then. Oh, as always, recuerda que hablamos español. And you know what to do down there, the honorable thing. Let's get after it, and I will see you guys next week.